Yeah, of course, and welcome everyone. I apologize if my voice goes out or cracks while I'm speaking. Had a little bit of sickness last week, but this is great. We appreciate everyone who's returning with us from last month. Those who are new, as Matt mentioned, this is just intended to be an informal environment. If we could do it in person, we just gather in person, give everyone a chance to ask questions and get answers, and just get to know some local attorneys a little bit and interact with legal assistants, and also get to know some of the local experts, entrepreneurs and others that we have in the community. And so that's this forum. Even though it's Zoom and we have this obstacle, it's meant to be informal, and so we encourage you to ask questions, whether it's in the chat, interrupt us, whatever you feel most comfortable with. This month, we wanted to focus on one topic, and we're doing this each month just to kind of zero in and give you some questions and talking points. But this month, we're going to focus on what type of entity you should use. What are the differences? What are the considerations? And to discuss this, we just wanted to introduce those of us who are here on the call to do this. Melanie Rubocki is the partner and managing partner of our Boise office and head of our business group here locally. So Melanie's been working in the startup community. Most of you know her for years and years now. And so I work with Melanie at Perkins and have been doing that for a number of years and focus on startup work as well. And then joining us today, we're really happy to have Matt McKinlay. And most of you may have even met Matt in the community at various events. Matt works with Amplēo and acts for a number of clients that we have as their CFO. And so he'll work with startups and assist with all things financial. Matt, any other details you'd like to share with the group just by way of introduction?
Sure. Derek, thanks very much for the intro, and thanks much for the invite to participate today. Many of you know probably my company by its former name, Advanced CFO. We went through a rebrand last fall to Amplēo, but we've helped, over our 30-year history, we've helped probably 300 companies raise several $100 million in capital. We work closely with Perkins and others in helping the startup community, and I'm glad to participate in today's call with you.
Perfect. Thanks.
We're glad to have you, Matt.
Yep.
You can keep us out of trouble.
That was your job for me, I think. But yeah,
we'll have a quid pro quo going. It'll all be good. It'll all be good.
Yeah.
So to dive in here, we don't want to be too formal. We've created some slides that have some talking points and whatnot, but we did submit it in advance for questions, and we did receive a question. Again, if you have other questions while we're talking about this, feel free to put that in the chat or interrupt us. But the first question we had relates to entity formation and the impact the type of entity might have on funding. And just to kind of lay the groundwork here with entity formation, there's a number of considerations that folks give as to what type of entity, whether it's tax driven, it's driven by wanting to protect your own personal liability. It also can be driven by just governance structure and the type of flexibility you want to have within your entity when it comes to day-to-day management and governance. And so there's a number of factors that come into play. And so as you're considering what type of entity to use, the decision is not made just in isolation as to, hey, will an investor fund me if I have this entity, or will they not fund me? It's typically a factor in your decision, but not necessarily the end-all, be-all decision. So in our experience, and Melanie, feel free to interrupt as you like, but in our experience, investors these days are comfortable funding into both corporations and LLCs. It's going to depend on your potential investor and their comfort level. And so, as you're making that consideration, and Matt, if you want to go to that first slide where we compare the differences, corporate, S corporate. Yeah, there we go. So,
and we apologize. We know this is sorry, Derek, I didn't mean to interrupt already, but we apologize that this is like teeny tiny font, but it's not really meant to be a PowerPoint that we'd be presenting as much as a quick reference chart for folks that we find really useful for people who are making an entity decision. And so we thought we would share this with you, and you can certainly keep perusing it as we're chatting. And if you've got some pointed questions, we're happy to deal with them. So,
yep.
And we'll also share this after with everyone that registered for the call.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Matt. So just to kind of anchor the conversation. So when choosing an entity, typically what we see is a corporation. That's an actual legal construct, right? Is a corporation that you incorporate at a state level, or a limited liability company. You'll see that we have this S corporation, center column here. An S corporation is a tax election. So it involves forming a corporation, C corporation, just the normal way, the standard process through the state, the Secretary of State. The S corporation is a tax election with the IRS. And so I just want to make that distinction. When you're talking about creating an entity and being able to bring on investors, having an S corporation, having elected that S corporation status, can create some roadblocks. Aside from those investor roadblocks, meaning that only specific types of individuals can be stockholders for S Corp status. So typically you can't have a VC or someone come in and fund you and still retain S Corp status. So if you're talking about what type of entity you should have, a corporation can have multiple investors, VCs, et cetera. A limited liability company can also have any type of investor, right? Individuals, VCs, et cetera. So some of the factors that might come into play as investors are taking a look at your entity is they might want to understand how it's structured. For a corporation, it's very cookie cutter and standard. You're going to have a board of directors, you're going to have your stockholders. Investors are very familiar with that construct and that setup, and it will be very easy for them to navigate your governing documents. When it comes to a limited liability company, they're also most of the time familiar with how they're set up, but there are, in an LLC, you have the ability to be a lot more flexible in the governing documents. And so that really becomes an area where if it's too creative or a little too wonky, you might have issues getting investors to sign up to into an operating agreement where you have entire control and no one else can have any say, right? And so investors are going to scope that out and want to kind of shake down and understand the governing structure of an LLC, and may even ask you to make changes before they invest. But from our perspective, picking the entity around the business and the relationship of the owners from the beginning works out fine. Bringing on investors, is another consideration that, like I said, the entity tends to not be a roadblock to investment. It could be, a small hurdle and changes needing to be made, but it's not typically a roadblock. Melanie.
Derek, well,
yeah,
I was going to add two things to what you said, not necessarily add two things to what you said, but clarify for the audience that there are more entities than the ones that we have on this list. But our conversation today is focused more on, you know, the kinds of companies that would be at a Trailhead, right? Like companies that are, you know, maybe looking for funding, you know, kind of more of the startup variety. You know, if you're like an engineer or something like that, you might be in a more, you know, professional limited partnership or something like that, which is a different conversation, but not necessarily what we were targeting today. And then the second thing I was going to ask Derek is actually I was going to ask Matt, in your experience with your clients, you know what I mean? How often have you seen, at the end of the day, entity being a, you know, a hurdle, you know what I mean, or a gating issue to that company or its progress or its ability to fund?
Yeah, well, selecting the right entity is really important, and I do see occasionally situations where 2 years down the road, the owner realizes I probably chose the wrong entity. The good news, I suppose, is that if you've chose the wrong entity, there's usually a remedy. You can make a change, right?
That's a really great point, Matt. It's rarely irreversible unless it's an S corp, and there's some weird issues there. But yeah, go. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the bigger mistake that we need to caution the audience is entrepreneurs have a tendency when they're starting something in the garage to just take dollars from their household budget and start funding a prototype, right? And I think the most important thing that an entrepreneur can do at that phase in the business's life cycle is create an entity of some sort and create a cash account, a separate, pristine cash account that you're not commingling with your household, right? Because you want to be able to demonstrate to an investor, I can manage an entity. This isn't commingled with the McKinlay household here, and for the legal protections that come through a specific entity, it's important. And I think it's important to do that, you know, really day one. And if you make a mistake and it's the wrong entity structure, that's an easier problem to solve than you know, getting a year down the road and realizing that your entity is commingled with your household, or your business rather is commingled with your household.
Yeah.
So Matt and Derek, it looks like we have a question in the chat, which I think kind of dovetails to where we're kind of going with this conversation. Margot's asking us, and Margot, we might need you to explain what a tiny business is, because sometimes it doesn't matter what the size of the business is. But her question goes to tax. So she's saying, you know, for a tiny business, you know, what's the best for tax purposes? So Matt Gilkerson, I'm wondering if you can flip to, I'm not sure which actual slide number it is, but there is a tax section in our chart. I think it might be the next slide.
Oh, go one back.
There you go. So Matt and Derek, we might want to chat a little bit about, you know, tax, you know what I mean, and the entity choices. And Margot, we don't know what kind of business you have, but I'm gonna say if it's a small business, I'd be leaning towards LLC, because really we never like C corps, if we're being honest, from a tax perspective. But Matt, maybe you have some color for that.
I'm curious more on that.
Yeah, well, one of the advantages of both an LLC and an S corp is they're pass-through entities, meaning these entities don't pay taxes in and of themselves. And particularly, you mentioned in your question, a one-owner tiny business. An LLC, really, for a single-member LLC, you don't even need to file a tax return for the LLC. All of the activity from the business can flow through to your personal tax return. And so, you know, it's a pretty slick entity for that purpose. You know, to file an LLC in Idaho, I think it's $100. There's just a short form application, $100, and then an annual renewal that comes that's free every year. They call it an annual report, but you fill out a postcard to do it. It's very easy to manage and maintain. There's no tax reporting annually for a single member LLC, and everything that happens in the business, you just report on your personal tax return. So for a single member LLC or a single member entity, I typically steer people to LLCs because they are administratively so easy to handle what you've described.
And I know this sounds like heresy, and I don't know if Derek is going to say this, but a lot of times, you know, you would think, I mean, for a very long time, the kind of pejorative out there was, oh, you have to be a Delaware C Corp. And a lot of people thought that's because it was the right entity choice. And what was really driving that narrative was, you know, the VC world's ease of wanting it to be a C Corp because they have certain, they themselves have certain tax situations, right, that make it difficult for them to, you know, invest into a flow through entity. And, you know, the world has caught up with that. And a lot of times if, you know, a VC or other private equity caught up with this a long time ago, but the VC world took a little bit longer than their private equity cousins. And, you know, but now they just create blocking entities and things like that. I mean, it's usually not a huge gating issue if you start out as an LLC anyways. But Matt, to your point, and I like the point you made earlier, which is, and by the way, none of these things are irreversible. You know, if you start out as an LLC, because that just makes sense the first year or two, because it's easier, a little lighter on the corporate formalities, and, you know, somebody wants to invest and they really want you to be a C Corp. I personally, in my history, have never seen someone say, oh gosh, I mean, I really want to invest, but gosh darn it, you're an LLC. I mean, if they're telling you that, it's kind of their polite way of saying your baby's ugly, and they don't really want to invest in you, because if they're a sophisticated investor, they too know it's fixable, you know, because you could either convert to a C Corp if their money's worth it, and or they could create a blocker. So, you know, that's their polite way of saying, thanks for the prom invite, but I got another date.
Yeah. It ends up being a logistical point in the process. Yeah, it's a fairly, in most cases, it's a fairly easy change. So yeah, that's right.
So Matt, I don't know if you, yeah. So Matt, I don't know if you've ever seen that in your experience, but when have you ever actually seen someone not fund because of the entity type?
Hey, I love your product. I love your service, but you're an LLC. That's not.
Yeah, I know I can make 10x
yeah.
off of this, but gosh darn it, you're an LLC.
Yeah.
If only you were a corporation, we could have had a beautiful relationship.
Yeah, there's never seen it, and don't expect we will. They're not difficult to change at the right time.
Yeah.
And I think Jason,
So
let me
Melanie,
see. I'm checking the. Oh, go ahead. Someone asking something or saying something?
yeah, this is Dan, and I'm on the phone, but I'm also on video, so it might look weird. Like
yeah, go Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
So I originally, I think I'm one of the ones who asked this question, and one of the things that, so we've been all of these almost. So we started as LLC, then with the S Corp for, you know, the Social Security tax, savings, and then back to an LLC because we actually really had foreign owners and we had to undo things, and that was messy. And we're now looking at C Corp, and the primary driver for us is R&D tax credits. We work with Smith's company, Strategic Tax Solutions, and one of our challenges is that not all of our owners are in Idaho and not all of them are in the U.S. So every dollar of tax they might save in the U.S. gets taxed somewhere else higher. And so we're trying to have, as a corp, file a real tax return that we can then use all of them, the tax credits. That's one of the, I don't know if that's ever crossed your radar, but that's been one of those things that we've been exploring. And we know on the other end of that is the double taxation. So we pay tax, then we want to take a dividend, we pay tax on the dividend, and we're in the midst of working with Eide Bailey to figure out, okay, how do we minimize our overall global tax?
Yeah.
What's the right structure? And I think that's just yet another consideration if the entity is not looking for VC funding, but looking to grow, you may outgrow your current structure as you
100%
also.
100%. And Dan, you're mentioning things, and I see a question in the chat from Jason Dodd. And Jason, I think your question's kind of going to similar things that Dan's mentioning with his, I don't want anyone on this call to get confused that we think, a C Corp is ever a bad entity. I mean, if you're going to go public, you're probably going to have to be a C Corp. And there's a certain, and Matt, not to put you on the spot on this question, but there's just also a certain aspect where corporations generally could be a little easier administratively when you have you start to cross a certain threshold with the amount of employees that you have. Some of the things we hear are, oh, I got to flip to a corporation because I want to have an equity comp plan. So that's a myth. You can have an equity comp plan in an LLC. That's not a gating issue. But when it comes to, and this would be, Matt McKinlay's wheelhouse more than Derek and mine, but we cross this. But when you start to get to employees and W-2s and withholding and stuff, Matt, I don't know if you have thoughts on, administration of a corporation. And then Dan and Jason will try to touch on the international piece, but that adds a whole other layer of complexity to things whenever you've got international owners. Because a lot of times, whether your entity is an LLC or a corporation, they're going to want to have a US subsidiary that deals with that tax situation, right? Whether it's a flow through up to them or it's a second layer of taxation. What we find, and this is a really broad answer because it depends on, the country, and do we have a tax treaty with them, and what I mean, what kind of entity are they, where they are. I mean, there's a whole lot of complexity to having foreign owners. And so that's probably a little beyond the scope of this today, in the sense of unless we get a little bit more fact specific. But with foreign owners, a lot of times we find that they end up having to create their own US entity that then is the owner in your entity. And then that entity is the one that ends up dealing with, wherever they are, right? Like the UK, the EU, Asia, wherever they are, then they deal with that on a foreign level, and it kind of buffers your entity a little bit from their situation. But I'm sorry, Matt, I asked you a question and then I didn't even let you answer it.
No, I think a pass-through, as you get bigger and want to maybe retain a war chest, and if you have more than one owner and everybody has their own tax things, that also becomes a problem because everybody's getting their K-1 and it's their personal tax returns and whatever their current situation is. It's like, okay, wow, paying tax on a big number personally, and the company might reimburse you for that, but the numbers get bigger and you're like, actually, it's probably time for our child to grow up and pay its own tax. That's kind of
100%. 100%.
Yeah. Dan, it's interesting. I think of this as like the construction industry, right? Most small homes that are built with wood frames, right? Think of that as an LLC or an S Corp. A wood frame will support the home and is perfectly suited for its purpose. But for a skyscraper, you would never build a skyscraper with a wood frame, right? You need a steel frame. You need something strong and robust. And that's kind of what a C Corp is like. It's just stronger and better suited to more complicated entity forms. There's more share classes. There's more options available for compensation and ownership. The opportunity to claim an R&D tax credit. There's just lots of things in a C Corp or a steel frame structure that a wood frame structure can't accommodate as well. And, it's kind of fun to see your business grow beyond perhaps a wooden frame, needing something a little bit more robust and stronger. And there are a lot of fun things that you can do with a C Corp. Administratively, they're harder to administer. There's more paperwork, there's more reporting, a little bit more expensive, and certainly because the company itself has tax liability and needs to prepare and file tax returns. Some of the tax implications are important to consider as well. But there is the right time and place for a C Corp, particularly for companies that are seeking outside capital from multiple classes or foreign entities and things like that.
And Matt, one thing on the legal side, I would add for the C Corp is that a lot of times we encourage folks to do an LLC when they're starting up or first creating their entity, because the corporate formalities of an LLC, and you're touching on this, Matt, right, are a lot less, and vigilance of compliance, there's not, you're not going to get caught as quickly. With a corporation, you have to adhere to the corporate formalities. I mean, you have to. And if you don't, you'll lose your limited liability veil, the veil of limited liability. And it's not like there's some, corporate compliance officer out there that's auditing it and then they take it away from you. But what happens, what we see, and you made a good point earlier on about folks that, we end up with these clients that like create a corporation, and then it's undercapitalized and they're like paying for things out of their own pocket, right? Instead of like contributing the money into the entity, putting it into a segregated account, and then using that to pay. And in a corporation, and then all of a sudden somebody, I'm just making an example up, but somebody sues them, right? They slip and fall in front of the storefront, or it's an employee that sues, or something happens, and a savvy lawyer on the other side will go right for the corporate veil, right? Because they'll recognize that the assets in the company may be not what they want to go after, and they want to pull the owners in too. And the way you pull the owners in is to compromise the corporate veil of the limited liability. And people don't think about that. They're like, oh, I set up my corporation, I have my entity, I'm
Melanie, you dropped off there.
Melanie, did we lose you?
We lose you, Melanie?
Yeah, I'll just expand on, and while we wait for Melanie to rejoin, her point is very valid. I'm involved in a case right now with a farmer where the farmer had an entity, a C corporation, but commingled the entity's operations with his household, and came into an insolvency situation, and the court has essentially pierced that corporate veil and is asserting that the individuals, the farmer's personal assets, are part of the bankruptcy estate because he didn't adhere to those corporate formalities. So Melanie's point is a very good one. One, it's important to have that corporate form, and two, it's important to adhere to that corporate form to keep that veil intact. One of the things that Melanie started to talk about too is some of the administrative requirements of a C Corp. So, for example, a C corporation is governed by a board of directors, and that means that you need to form a board. The board needs to meet on a regular basis. Decisions need to be approved by the board, in some cases shareholders, and they need to keep minutes and in the case of many companies, there are those corporate formalities that are required, more so in a C Corp than in an LLC. But it's important to keep those corporate formalities intact, regardless of the entity structure, just to keep that curtain drawn between the entity and the owner.
Yeah, great point, Matt.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Because my box didn't light up, so I didn't know if I was having just an issue entirely or if I kind of buffered there for a minute.
Sound great.
Perfect. And one of the things we see, not to beat the corporate formalities to death, but one of the things, Derek, you and I see a lot is now the company's ready for exit, right? That somebody, either they want, either a big investment's going to come in and or a change in control is going to happen, and they come in and they do due diligence. And where we see the corporate formalities not adhere to is there will be all these decisions in the history of the company, but there will be no record where the board met, let alone the shareholders. We'll see companies where, they gave options out like Pez, but they never approved them. You know what I mean? Yeah. And the board never approved them. And, we've even had companies where, the company had 1 million shares authorized, because with a corporation, you have to have a specific number authorized, and they'll have 1 million shares authorized, and we'll look at the cap table and it'll have like 1.4 million shares on it. And we're like, like, where'd the other 400,000 come from? They don't exist.
Yeah. And that's a real point.
These are real
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, speaking from experience from the past, little while, but no, that's a really valid point, because a lot of times, these investors, they're going to come in. I mean, they want to know your business first and foremost, whether they're acquiring you or looking to invest in you, right? They want to understand your team, your business, the prospects, whether it makes good business sense for them to invest. But then they're going to open up the hood and have their lawyers look underneath, right? And so that it just becomes a part of every big investment process, at least every exit, where lawyers are going to be popping the hood and kicking the tires and looking at the details. And the cleaner you are, the more you've adhered to the structure that you've chosen, the easier that process is going to be. And you're not going to have that be what deters someone from investing or acquiring, right? Or have that be something that decreases the value someone's willing to invest or pay. And so, yeah, that's a really good point. Just keeping it clean is key. And oftentimes in the hustle, startups overlook that just because they're a lean team. They're trying each day just to grow their business and do whatever they can to bring in some money. But adhering to those and keeping it clean really makes a huge impact in the future.
Hey, let me, Derek and Melanie, let me pose a question for you that I get a lot, and it is for startups. They ask the question, where should I incorporate? Right? I see that a lot of companies incorporate in Delaware or Texas or New York. Nevada, it's free, right? There's no income tax. I'm going to incorporate there. How would you answer the question? Where's the right domicile?
Want to take a first crack at that one, Derek?
Yes. Yeah, of course.
We have all kinds of thoughts on this one, Matt.
So
yeah, I do too.
Early on, as Melanie mentioned, there was a time where everyone said, you have to be a Delaware CCorp, right? I mean, that's just, if you're going to get some sort of, sophisticated investor coming in, they're going to want to see a Delaware CCorp. And I can say even in law school, right? I heard that same thing just years ago. But the reality is that it doesn't have to be Delaware. Delaware is familiar to a lot of folks, and so that's why they say it. Delaware can also be expensive. When you incorporate an entity, you're also signing up for that state's franchise fees, tax fees, whatever the case may be with that entity. And so that's something to consider as you incorporate. The other part of that is that incorporation is just getting your company founded and recognized from a state. Where your actual business is located is going to also dictate, registering that business. So for example, we have, a number of clients that are located here in Idaho, right? They've built their business in Idaho, their offices are here, most of their employees are here, but they're a Delaware corporation. And so they incorporate in Delaware, they pay whatever franchise fees every year are required by Delaware, but they also have to register that corporation in Idaho. They're a foreign corporation that's here located in Idaho. And so they register here and they're subject to whatever taxes and state, franchise fees and whatnot come along with, having an entity that's located in Idaho. And so that is going to dictate a lot of the tax, right? Where your business is located, even though it might be a Nevada corporation, if you're still running, your office here in Idaho, your employees are here, et cetera, there's still going to be taxes and whatnot that you're subject to just by virtue of doing business here. And so, from our standpoint, Melanie, can chime in on this too. It's not really going to matter that much which state you've chosen to incorporate. You should probably have a fairly good reason for doing that. I don't know why you'd be a Idaho company with a New
Don't do
Hampshire
California.
corporation.
That's the one we
That's
can
a
tell
good
you
point.
don't do California.
Don't do California. But aside from that, right? I mean,
And that's not a dig at any Californians. California as a business entity state is
yes,
very difficult.
yes.
It's just a very, it's an expensive state. It's very difficult. And it's like literally like the Hotel California. You can go in, but you can never get back out.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. Yeah, so from that perspective, Melanie, if you have more to add, it's not really going to matter that much which state you've chosen, aside from, you know, California and understanding, you know, the risks and, you know, I guess overhead and additional, you know, steps that may come into play there. But whether it's in Idaho or Delaware, if that's the decision, you know, you're going to have to foreign register in Idaho anyway. And so it's just a choice of what you feel more comfortable with there.
And I think, Derek, the only thing I would add to it is similar to the entity choice. A lot of these things, well, with the exception of starting in California, which is very difficult to get out of, a lot of these things aren't irreversible either. You know what I mean? If you for some reason have moved your business from, you know, X state to Idaho or whatever, and by the way, we're not pushing that you set up in Idaho as much as Idaho is like probably the least expensive state, one of the least expensive states to, like, from a franchise tax perspective, because there just isn't any.
Yeah.
And whatever, and Matt, this is more your wheelhouse, but, you know, whatever you're going to be paying in, like, you know, corporate sales, whatever, you're going to be paying anyways, whether, you know, I mean, you're going to have to report what you've made in the state, regardless, you know, of whether, or eventually you'll have to report what you've made in the state, you know, whether you're, you know, domiciled here or not. But a lot of states, you know, like toggling back and forth between states is a check the box document, with the exception of some places. Some of them require like a little mini merger that's form over substance, but in any event, it's not an insurmountable, you know, task. So Matt, I don't know if we answered your question, but I'm sure you have some thoughts on, you know, being domiciled in a state, you know, versus like having to go register, because I would imagine with a lot of your companies,
Yeah.
and I think what's really tricky is a lot of our clients now are like e-commerce, and, you know, and it's like, okay, when did you trip the nexus of another state that you need to be dealing with it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big issue and probably a separate topic. But yeah, if you're doing business in a state, I think the Cliff Notes version is you need to register to do business in any state that you're doing business in. You know, let me just kind of offer too, in terms of Delaware. You know, in years past, as you mentioned, there was a big push by investors if they're going to invest in companies to be a Delaware corporation. The reason for that is I think Delaware has a very robust set of case law.
It's got a great body of law, and it's very management company friendly law, you know, versus some other states, not to keep picking on California, but California is a very employee friendly state and very anti-company, you know, on a spectrum, right? You know, Delaware, on the other hand, is very pro, and it's not at the sake of the employees. They just have a very robust body of law that clearly defines, you know, board duties, you know, adherence to corporate formalities, things of that nature. So, you know, but you pay for it. To be a part of it.
I've got a client here in Idaho. They're formed in Delaware. They haven't turned a profit yet. And yet they pay $2,500 or $3,000 a year in taxes to Delaware, and it's, you know, for that purpose. They've got a separate chancery court system to take on corporate issues, and you know they haven't used that yet. Maybe they will down the road as they grow and mature. But for any startup, I think it's probably a little overkill at this point to get out of the gate into Delaware. Idaho will do just fine, and it's $100. That's
usually our thoughts. And again, not irreversible, right? Again, same point I made earlier. I have yet to have an investor or acquirer go, gosh darn it, I would love to invest in your company, except you're not in Delaware, right? Like they may say that, but you know, it's truly not gating. It's just an issue. And if they really want the company to be in Delaware, it's something we can do part of closing. It's very simple.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many other questions we have in the chat, but I mean, and for those who asked questions in the chat, I don't know if we've fully addressed your questions, but we're happy to, you know, expound on any of these things. And as Matt Gilkerson, as you said, we can share the presentation with folks after our meeting today.
Absolutely, and some great charts there.
Hey, Melanie, I'll pose another question that I hear a lot, and I know you do too. But let's talk about employee awards or stock options, or is there an entity that's favored when the owners want to compensate their employees through stock?
That's a great question, because I think the answer will probably surprise you. I think they're both. So a corporation, one thing I think we should touch on, Matt, in answering that question is that one of the things Derek and I find all regularly is people don't realize that if I own a company and you come and work for me, and let's just say the company's worth something north of zero, whatever it is, right? It's just worth something north of zero. If I give you stock instead of cash, right, instead of a paycheck or money, that still is taxed. And I think a lot of people don't realize that if I give you stock, they're going to have to pay, you're going to have to pay taxes on it. So if I give you $1 worth of stock and your tax bracket is 40%, I'm just making something up, right? You're going to have to pay 40 cents. You know what I mean? And the company's going to have to withhold. And it just because it's stock, it still gets thrown onto the, you know, the tax. You still got to withhold, and it's going to show up at the end of the year, right? As part of your income. And so one of the things, so a lot of times companies use options, right? So they end up using stock options as an alternative to giving folks equity, primarily because it's a way, it does a few things for folks. One, it keeps people off the cap table for now, right? So now you're not dealing with them as an owner yet. They can exercise their option and become an owner, but most people don't exercise their option until it's in the money, you know, and usually that's at a liquidity event, right? So if I give you an option and the strike price is $1, because again, the option has to be given at a strike prices that's the equivalent of fair market value at the time of the grant, or you'll also create a tax issue. Again, this will actually be a topic, everybody, in a few weeks from now, so we can kind of get into it more granularly at that point. But an option, if the strike price is appropriately done, won't have a tax impact at that point, right? It won't be a tax triggering event. With an LLC, what you can do is you can actually give people equity at any time. You just have to do it in the form of profits interests. And it's very complicated from a tax perspective. But the point is that in an LLC, if you do want to give somebody ownership of the company, like you do want them to be on the cap table today, they
why are we doing this? What are we resolving with these?
I don't know. That was getting interesting. But in any event, with an LLC, there's actually a little bit of additional flexibility, but it's definitely something that I would encourage you to go talk to your advisors and consultants about, to get your operating agreement and equity plan for an LLC set up properly so that you do it properly, because then you really need the right, accounting folks to help you manage your capital accounts, because otherwise it just becomes a mess. So I guess to answer your question, corporations are, it's just tried and true. You know what I mean? An option plan is just tried and true. Like people just know what that is. They know what it looks like. A lot of folks get it at their own jobs. And so that's fairly simple. But what I don't want people to think is that you can't replicate that in an LLC, because not only could you replicate it, there's actually more possibilities with an LLC, but it just takes a fine knife to carve that out. So I don't know if that answered your question, Matt, but.
Yeah, absolutely. We get that question a lot, and I think in times past the default answer would have been, well, to award options, you need to be a C Corp, and I agree with you that I think any of these three entity choices that we've discussed will accommodate some form of equity compensation for employees.
Right. You just have to understand what that looks like and be comfortable administering it, right? I mean, that's what it boils down to. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't administer it correctly, it becomes both a problem for the company and the participant that you're trying to award. Nothing gets folks crabbier than an audit or an unexpected tax bill. You know, Derek and I, Matt, have had clients come to us, and you know, the person will, you know, it's like March or April, and you know, they've got a person that they gave, you know, on one hand, they're out there telling investors that they're worth $10 million. You know, on the other hand, they're giving, you know, their employee 5 to 10% of the company, you know what I mean? Because they can't afford to pay them. You know what I mean? And then the employees, like, you know, gets a tax bill for like $150,000 or something crazy like that, right? And they're like, what? You know what I mean? And it's like, well, I mean, if they just gave you
with no cash to support it.
Yeah, with no cash, right? Because like who's paying for that, right? And so, you know, that tends to make relationships strained.
Yeah. Hey, off topic, but as I kind of thought about some points I wanted to cover today, your comment there prompted me on it. And that is kind of the tax treatment of a pass-through entity. I've seen a number of times where an LLC, you've got an LLC with several members, and at the end of the year, these members suddenly get a big K-1 with tons of income that they haven't received any cash for, per se, and they're asking themselves, hey, wait a minute, you're attributing $100,000 of income, and I don't have the cash to pay for it. And so one of the learnings is, for a pass-through entity, it's important for owners to keep their eye on the profits of the company, to distribute. It's fairly common for a pass-through entity to make tax distributions to their owners or members, so that there's not adverse tax consequences or tax liabilities that they're obligated for without the ability to pay. One thing that I see a lot is, for an LLC that's growing, they may be showing a profit, but they're reinvesting those profits into the business. And it's just important to be aware of those downstream tax implications on the members or the owners in those circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that was probably part of like Dan's. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Matt, but I think that was part of maybe Dan. I think Dan was kind of suggesting that early on, and you know, and I think, you know, that kind of goes to your point earlier of, it might be time to, you know, fortify the building, right? It may be time. I personally think that any company that's starting needs to have the right, you know, I mean, of course, I think legal is important. That's because that's my world, but I think it's equally important to have, at the risk of sounding like a sales pitch for you, Matt, have a Matt or someone, like, if you can't afford a CFO or somebody to do it, that's okay. There's solutions out there, you know, for fractional, part-time, you know, CFOs and accounting firms that are willing to not just do your taxes at the end of the year, right? Like, I mean, that's probably actually not the right person to help you with these kinds of decisions. And, you know, we often encourage our clients to, you know, constantly reevaluate, because I think you're making a good point that there's a moment in time where a company just may want to be sitting on its cash, you know what I mean, and or redeploying it. And I think Dan made the point earlier of, you know, it's just time for them to grow up and pay their own taxes. And then separately, you just may have these, you know, passive investors that, you know, they don't want to get a K-1. They don't want to complicate their tax situation, you know, and that's another reason why investors will want a C Corp, because at the end of the day, they don't want to be that active in your company. They just want to invest. They just want to invest, and in a few days, that'd be nice. A few years, you know, that every dollar they put in turns into 5 to 7, right?
Yeah, but I'd emphasize what you're sharing about. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just complicated. Yeah, it's just complicated because do you have 5 owners? You have 1 owner. Do you have foreign owners or non-foreign owners? And so, I mean, there's a lot of pieces that go into the mix. And so having a good attorney, and then, you know, if you're starting a software company or there's some kind of other technology company and people are paying ahead of the delivery of the product, and how's your rev rec looking, and are your books out of whack? And then trying to bring on an investor, and it's like, well, you've taken a bunch of money, so it looks like revenue because you've counted it as revenue, but you still have a huge liability of something that you owe. And you know, there's a whole bunch of those complicated things. So having somebody like a Matt because your CPA is just going to look at your books and do your taxes.
Yeah,
they're not going to actually. They're not going to go under the hood and go, "Hey, where'd this money come from, and what do you owe to people?" And you're like, "Oh yeah." They're not going to necessarily help you look at what is your tax liability, and are you paying quarterlies or not paying quarterlies, and are you doing that by choice or just because you're ignorant? So those are all important pieces to this puzzle as well, because that pass-through mechanism is you are liable for those taxes personally. And so be ready.
Well, and Dan, you are also raising another point that whenever you have these pass-through, you know, and Matt, I think this kind of goes to your point too, like different owners might have different profiles personally, right? And you want someone sophisticated to be looking at that, because let's say, you know, Dan, you and Matt are in a partnership together. Well, there might be a year where you could just really use the losses. You know what I'm saying? And one of the nice things about an LLC is you can treat, you know, losses different than, you know, income different than profit, you know what I mean? Different than ownership, right? Like you don't have to, even if you own 10%, you could take 90% of the losses if you wanted to. But again, it takes somebody very sophisticated to help you navigate those things. And, you know, what will then be the impact, you know, going forward. Because once you start moving those levers, right, it changes things going forward. It rejiggers capital accounts and all that kind of stuff. It's just not something, you know, you want to be sitting and doing on your own at home. You know what I mean? At the end of the year, you know, it's something that you want to be thoughtful about. And, you know, to Matt's point, it's not always going to be, you know, the run-of-the-mill person, or I'm sorry, Dan said this, but you know, they're just gonna take your numbers. They're gonna take your numbers and they're gonna distill a number, and then they're gonna say this is what you owe at the end of the year. They're not necessarily gonna dig into those numbers and say, "Gosh, this seems out of whack. How'd you get here?"
Exactly.
Yep.
Whereas a Matt might do that.
Right. So we're about 5 minutes to 10. So I did want to like open it up for maybe one more question from the audience if there's any, and then I wanted to just wrap up with the announcement of our next Koffee Klatch event in May. Any other questions? Any last comments? I'll open it up and then do a quick wrap up.
Yeah, this is Dan again. I would just say thanks for you guys for setting this up. It's unfortunate not enough smaller entities are here to get that level of wisdom of, you know, the gotchas. And I mean, it literally took me like 3 years to figure out what the heck a pass-through entity it was, even though I was paying the tax on it. I was trying to figure these things out, right? And then add on top of that, you know, our accountant would talk about self-employment tax. I had no idea what the hell that was, because I was a W-2 for like, you know, first 15 years of my life. I didn't, you know what I mean? So I'm like, it really is important to talk to people who get this and who have your interest in mind. And
well, share the word. Share the word, Dan, because that's we're hoping. The whole point of this Koffee Klatch is exactly this, right? Is to have this kind of, you know, no questions stupid forum. You know what I mean? And we're trying to be pointed in topics just to keep people directed, because we worried that if we did it monthly and it was just open season, we'd be all over the board, right? And so one person might get their question answered that month, but there might be 9 or 10 others that are like, oh, that's why did we talk about that? So we're trying to be directed, but we want it to be free form like today was, you know, give hopefully good content to folks, but allow folks to, you know, ask questions. No questions. You know, what do they say? No, there's no dumb questions, right? Just the people
Right.
who don't ask them.
Exactly. Emphasis on that. And exactly, just to reiterate, and also everything kind of does tie into each other. Melanie, you even mentioned kind of some pieces to the next week's.
Oh yeah, go ahead and put our slide up, Matt. Yeah.
So it's around, founder ownership. How do you divide up that pie? Ownership rights. How do you avoid the 10% issue? And so we'll be following up with everyone on this call. We will also be sharing this recording to everyone that registered. And Dan, thank you for those last closing comments. Again, thank you so much, Matt, for taking time to join us. And of course, always Melanie and Derek, thank you so much for your time today and sharing this very valuable insight with us all. And look forward to seeing you all next month, May 26th at 9 a.m.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay,
Thanks for getting it all set
Thanks,
up.
Matt.
And thanks,
you.
Matt McKinlay, for being our special guest today.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you, Melanie. Thanks, Derek. Nice to
bet.
see you all.